So I would like to introduce the first speaker, which is Dani Cekun, if I pronounce it correctly, Director Data of WageIndicator Foundation, who will present findings from data from Ethiopia and Indonesia. Dani, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, so what we want to do now is to share some data with you, just to prepare the ground for the panel later. So what I want to start with is to look at the female labor participation in these sectors of interest, so garment, textile, and leather, in the three countries we are considering today, so Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Turkey. So for Ethiopia, it's kind of hard to find reports on this. According to a 2018 report from Industry All, we see that women constituted then more than 80% of the workforce in textile and garment. As wage indicator, we have more recent data from our Decent Work Check project, in which we interview workers in factories. In 2023-24, we interviewed 22 factories, and there we recorded that 70% of the workers were women. So let's say we can say it's between 70 and 80%, more or less. For Indonesia, there is recent data. There is a country profile from Femnet from last year, which indicates that women comprise approximately 82% of the workforce in the textile industry and between 60 to 80 in footwear. These numbers are kind of confirmed by our Decent Work Check project. We interviewed 368 factories in the last 2 years. And there we observed that 72% of the workers were women. So here we have a range between 60 and 80, we can say. In Turkey, there is less information. According to trade union sources, 60% of the workers in textile and 80% in garment are women. There is a study which we are also considering today in our analysis that was published last year by the Anchor Research Institute with data collected in Turkey in 2021 in 3 factories. And in that, we see that the female labor participation was between 50 and 70. So the percentages vary a bit among these 3 countries, but we can say that definitely garment, textile, and leather are women-dominated sectors in terms of labor participation. Next slide. Thanks. So what are the Decent Work Check projects in Ethiopia and Indonesia? You will hear this word often in this presentation because these projects are run in these 2 countries. In Indonesia, it's actually called Makin Terang, which means getting brighter. And the aim is to improve wages and working conditions in the sector. How? By strengthening worker representation and promoting diversity in the leadership, and particularly in terms of gender inclusion. Actually, in Ethiopia, we have been focusing on gender more in the last phase of the project, so in the last couple of years. These projects use worker-driven data. As I said, we interview workers in factories to facilitate social dialogue and to monitor their working conditions. Key aspects of these programs include strengthening the trade unions. Of course, we try to improve collaboration between the garment and textile unions and national and international worker supporting organizations. Empowering diverse worker representation. So we try to make sure that women and other marginalized groups have a voice in the negotiations, and expanding outreach. Actually, the program has been operating for 8 years across 5 regions in Indonesia and 7 years across 3 regions in Ethiopia. So they are quite extensive in terms of geography and also coverage of in terms of time. Next slide. To make it a bit more clear how the process works, so how the journeys of the factories who work with us are. This is a kind of a timeline. So we start from data collection. We collect data on wages and working conditions by asking questions based on 49 labor law topics. And we use for this the decent work check surveys. In Indonesia, we work with 4 trade union partners in 5 regions, and our data collectors are actually union members. In Ethiopia, we work with Textile Federation in 3 regions, and the data is collected by our WageIndicator team members, whom you will meet later in this panel. In Indonesia, there is an additional step that's training and organizing. So unions are trained to interpret the factory survey results and to use them to strengthen social dialogue and collective agreements. In Indonesia, we also conduct the so-called workers' priority polls, which are, again, surveys, but they collect data on the workers' needs beyond the basic labor laws. So they give more voice to workers that normally are underrepresented. So women workers, for example, to check beyond labor law, what are the topics that are of more interest to them. And we also organize learning circles in non-unionized factories to educate workers on their rights and self-representation, and ultimately paving the way for union representations there as well. We then need to ensure that trade unions use this data, which is actually publicly available, in their social dialogue meetings. So these social dialogues need to happen. And we monitor progress and results of these. In Ethiopia, we now started women-only social dialogue meetings, which seem to be quite successful. And we also collect and code collective agreements. So at this point, after all this work, what we expect is to see improved working conditions and collective worker representation. In Indonesia, we check this by using surveys by monitoring the social dialogues very closely, with reports on the topics discussed and the decisions taken. While in Ethiopia, we collect again data on wages and working conditions through a new round of decent work check surveys, through which we check if there has been improvements or changes. Next slide, please. Okay, so talking about the bipartite meeting reports from Indonesia, again from the last 2 years, there's an interesting data that came out there, which tells us already something about the issue of women representation. Because, in Indonesia, as I said, we interviewed 368 factories. That means that part of this project, so the number of workers involved is quite huge, is 819, actually 20,000 workers. And we know that 72% of these workers are women. Then we also look at the number of union members. So the union density in these factories is 24%. And of these, 65% are women. This means that, okay, this is in line with the female labor participation in these factories, right? But if we look at the number of union officials, so the representatives of unions, we see that the percentages are switched. So women are actually only 34% of the union officials in this factory. And this, as I said, already tells us something about these 34% women who need to represent a population of 65%. Next slide. Okay, I now want to take you a bit more deeper into the results of these surveys. This graph is showing the percentage of non-compliant factories, that is, factories that have less than 90% compliance. And what you see here are combined topics. So the questions we ask are combined into different topics. What you can see here, the blue is 2023, the orange is 2024. So the right to organize category, as you see, has shown the most non-compliance trend in both years. And what is more striking is the increase that we observe in non-compliance between 2023 and 2024, not only in that topic, which more than doubled actually, but also in all the other topics. And the maternity and work category, which is the one we are looking at today, was the third most non-compliant last year, and now it's second most non-compliant category. So things worsened on that regard as well, unfortunately. Next slide. If we look at Ethiopia, so same years, less factories because the project is much smaller. And we check again the average percentage of non-compliance factories. And here we see a different trend, so an improvement from 2023 to 2024. Social security is in both years the most non-compliant topic, but we observe a significant decrease. And also important, the maternity and work category was the fifth most non-compliant in 2023. And now it's the most complied for category. You see non-compliance decreased from 20% to only 7%. So big improvement there. Next slide. Now we look more in detail at subtopics. So these are specific questions that were asked in the survey, and they are gender related. Somehow, this is Indonesia again and again. We see, unfortunately, a decrease in, increase in non-compliance. So for 2 consecutive years, menstrual leave, which is a right that is quite typical of Indonesia, like particular. It's a right to take 2 days of leave. And that's the most non-compliant of all in both years among these gender subtopics. And this is followed by maternity leave and respective payment, and paternity leave and respective payment. What is striking in this graph as well is the provision of breastfeeding breaks. So if you see, it wasn't problematic in 2023 because there was just a 4% non-compliance, and now there is a 22% non-compliance. So this is really an issue to think about. Next slide. In Ethiopia, if we look at the same topics, we see in most cases an improvement. The most non-compliant in 2023 among the gender subtopics was the provision of not assigning hazardous work to women during pregnancy or breastfeeding months. The non-compliance, decreased in 2024, but remains kind of high. But 2 topics surpassed in non-compliance. One is the payment of same pay for the same work. And the other, which is quite frightening, is the reporting of sexual harassment cases. You see, it's more than non-compliance has more than doubled from 2023 to 2024. Next slide, please. We also have additional data from Indonesia, and particularly here from the workers' priority polls. Of the more than 115,000 answers to the topics, what are the topics of interest for workers, about 8,500 were related to one of the gender subtopics. And again, we see that menstrual leave was the most common request. So maybe the fact that it's a problematic topic is shown here as well, because it's really something that workers want to discuss. And the expectation of the workers was that leave should be granted without the proof of illness or a doctor's note. Next slide. We also have data, as I was saying, from Indonesia's bipartite meetings. And this is a graph that is showing the most frequently negotiated topics in these meetings in 2023. And yeah, maybe the representation issue that we discussed at the beginning is coming up. Because you see how there were so many talks on company facilities, on wages, on employment security, on working hours, but very, very few on maternity and work. And as you can see in the next slide, it's the same in 2024. So again, other topics picked up. Wages is always very much discussed, but also right to organize and working hours. But maternity and work remains one of the topics that is least discussed in bipartite meetings. Next slide. Okay, from let's say other rights, we moved now to wages and to the gender pay gap in particular. So in the survey, next to compliance on these topics, we also ask people about their wage. This graph is showing the median wages we collected since 2018 in the two projects. So green is Ethiopia, Indonesia is the blue. In Ethiopia, well, what is interesting here is that we see kind of the same trend that we saw in terms of compliance of the different labor law topics, because there were some highs and lows in Ethiopia, but in general, we see that the gender pay gap decreased over time. And last year, we recorded an 18.6% gap. In Indonesia, the gap seemed to be kind of stable for years, so between, let's say, 5 and 8%, till last year when it increased significantly. Here you see, I've put also Turkey because from the study I mentioned earlier, so from the Anchor Research Institute study, where they collected data in these three factories from 2021, we can see that there is a gap in Turkey that goes between 4 and 17%. Sorry, I didn't say it, but the N you see next to each percentage is the number of workers we interviewed. So you see in Indonesia many more because the project is bigger. And the study in Turkey interviewed between 60 and 170 workers. And I can, in the next slide, I can explain a bit more about this study in Turkey. So this was carried out, as I said, in 3 garment factories. They interviewed 935 workers. And these are the key findings from that study. And what is interesting is that the gender pay gap is different for garment factories in different parts of the country. So the gaps, as I showed, are variable between 4 and 17, but actually 2 of the factories were around 4 or 5% gender pay gap. And they were located in lower cost areas, so cheaper areas where there were fewer employment opportunities. So the factories basically didn't have more to offer than the minimum wage to attract these workers. And so there is only a small gender pay gap because most men and women earn close to the minimum wage. So let's say women cannot go below that, I would add. But the other factory had a higher gender pay gap. So the other factory was the one with 17%. And that was located in an area with a high competition for labor, high living costs, and they had to pay more than the minimum wage to attract the workers. But this mostly benefit men because men in that factory dominate higher paying occupations. Actually, we see that in 2 out of the 3 factories, there is a dominance of supervisory and managerial positions by men. And also the report found consistently higher wages for men-dominated occupations. So basically the average base wages for men-dominated occupational groups are consistently higher than the average base wages for women-dominated groups. Also, in these factories, they found that women frequently earned less than men doing the same type of work. So, for example, even at high level, the average base wage for supervisor and managers was higher for men than for women in all the 3 factories they considered. Next slide. So when we think about the gender pay gap, it's true that there are many factors and many ways to calculate it and to look at it. But what is striking in those Turkish factories, but also what we see in Ethiopia, is that for the same job, you see a difference in pay. And this is my last slide. We took the two occupations for which we had the most data, or data for all years. Or almost all years, and these are cutting machine operator and weaving machine operator, and we could find wages for between 10 to 79 workers every year, and could compare them. And what you can see, I mean, you can pick any of the years that you see here, and you will see how striking the difference is, because even when the wages go down or go up, you see how, anyways, women will earn less than men. So food for thought for everybody. I give it back